The room went silent. 2,000 people, mid-laugh, frozen. The comedian stood at the microphone. He did not move. Frank Sinatra sat in the front row. His face was red. His jaw was tight. Dean Martin had said 4 words, just 4 words, into the microphone, calm as stone. The laughter stopped, not slowly, not gradually. It stopped the way a light stops when you cut the power. This is what happened on a night in October 1963. The night Dean Martin reminded 2,000 people that some lines do not get crossed. Not while he is watching. The Copa room at the Sands Hotel held 2,000 people. On a good night it felt like the center of the world. On a Rat Pack night it was Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Joey Bishop, Peter Lawford. They were not just famous. They were the biggest act in the country. Movies, television, Las Vegas. They owned all of it. By October 1963, the Rat Pack had been performing together for years. The world knew their names. Presidents knew their names. The shows at the Sands were impossible to get tickets for. People flew in from New York, from Chicago, from London. They flew in just to stand in that room for 2 hours. The shows were loose. That was the whole point. They came out with drinks. They told jokes. They roasted each other. The audience never knew what was coming next. That was the magic. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody rehearsed it. The rule was simple. Anything goes. Keep it moving. Keep it funny. Make them feel like they are at the best party they will ever attend. It worked because these men actually liked each other. That was the thing most performers could not fake well enough. The ease between them was real. The laughter was real. The audience felt the difference between performance and the genuine article. This was the genuine article. But even inside that freedom there were rules. Unspoken ones. The kind that do not need to be written down because everyone already understands them. You could joke about Frank. Everyone did. His temper. His obsession with perfection. All fair game. Frank laughed at that. He could take it. You could joke about his suits, his schedule, the way he expected every room to operate at his pace. Frank took all of that. He even seemed to enjoy it. But you did not mention Ava Gardner. Not as a joke, not ever. Ava Gardner had been the love of Frank Sinatra's life. Everyone knew it. Their marriage had lasted 2 years. Their connection had lasted much longer. The divorce had broken something in Frank that never fully healed. He did not talk about it. He did not let anyone else talk about it either. Ava had been the one person on earth who did not need anything from Frank Sinatra. Not his fame, not his connections. She was as famous as he was. She did not orbit around him. She existed next to him. That was what made her different from everyone else. When she was gone, a part of Frank went quiet. Not his voice, not his public presence, something internal. Something only the people closest to him could see. Nobody in the Rat Pack needed to be told this. They just knew. The way you know not to mention certain things around certain people. You read the room. You read the person. You stay on the right side of the line. Until this night, the show started well. It always did. Frank sang 3 songs. The audience was already on their feet by the second one. Dean told a story about a show in Miami that may or may not have been true. The laughter filled the room from the floor to the ceiling. Sammy did an impression that had 3 different people in the front row leaning over to the person next to them to ask if Sammy had actually just done that. He had. Den caught Sammy's eye from across the stage and shook his head slowly in the way that meant, "You are going to get us all in trouble one day, and I cannot wait." Peter Lawford stood in the wrong place at the wrong moment and became the punchline of a joke that nobody planned. 2,000 people roared. The first 40 minutes felt like the best night anyone in that room had ever spent. That was the Rat Pack at full speed. The sense that anything could happen. The sense that you were witnessing something that could not be reproduced or rehearsed. You were just there for it, and that was enough. Then the comedian took the microphone. Joey Bishop was the straight man of the group, the one who set up the jokes, the one who knew how to read a room and push it exactly far enough. He was sharp. He was fast. He was trusted. The first joke about Frank was standard. His suits. His reputation for demanding perfection in the studio. The audience laughed. Frank laughed. Normal. The second joke went a little further. Frank's ego. The way he expected everyone to be ready the moment he walked in. Still fine. Frank smiled, waved it off. The audience loved it. The third joke got a bigger laugh. Dean grinned from the side of the stage. Sammy shook his head in mock disbelief. The room was electric. Nobody was worried yet. Then came the fourth joke. It started like the others. A setup, a pause, a line. But the line had a name in it. A name that no one expected to hear. A name that no one in that group said in public. Ava Gardner. The audience laughed. Loud, genuine. 2,000 people who did not know the rule, who did not know what that name meant, who only heard the punchline and reacted. Frank's smile disappeared. His jaw went tight. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair. His eyes went flat. Not angry. Not yet. Something worse than angry, something hollow. The comedian moved to the next line. He could feel the laugh. He pushed it, added more. The audience laughed harder. Nobody looked at Frank. Or maybe they did not want to look, because if you looked, you saw something that was not supposed to be there. Frank Sinatra sitting in the front row of his own show, being laughed at. Not with. At. There is a difference. Everyone in that room who knew Frank understood the difference. The audience did not. They were just laughing. Dean saw it from the side of the stage. Nobody else moved. Nobody else said anything. The show was moving fast. The comedian was on a roll. The audience was locked in. Stopping it would be awkward. It would break the energy. It would make things complicated. Nobody wanted to be the one to step in. Dean watched Frank's face for another few seconds. He saw the jaw hands. He saw the eyes. That was enough. But here is the thing about that moment that most people miss. Dean did not move immediately. He gave it a breath. He waited to see if Frank would handle it himself. Frank was capable of it. Frank was capable of many things. Dean knew this. Frank did not move. He sat there, jaw tight, hands gripping, the laughter washing over him. And he sat there because that is what you do when you are Frank Sinatra in the Copa room. You do not show weakness. You do not give the audience a reason to look at you the wrong way. You sit there and you take it and you fold it up and you carry it home. Dean understood that too. He understood that Frank would absorb this the way Frank absorbed everything that hurt him. Silently, completely, without asking anyone to stop it. Dean decided not to let him. What Dean did next was not planned. He did not think it through. He did not weigh the options. He just moved. But what happened before Dean moved is the part most people never heard about. Because what happened in those seconds before Dean walked forward tells you everything about who Dean Martin really was. Dean was not the most famous one in the group. That was Frank. He was not the most talented performer. Many would argue that was Sammy. He was not the funniest. That was Joey. Dean was the one people liked most. Not feared. Not admired from a distance. Liked. The way you like someone who never makes you feel like you have to perform around them. He had a gift for reading people. He knew when Frank was fine and when Frank was not. He knew when a room needed energy and when it needed to breathe. He made it all look effortless. That was the performance people never saw. The work underneath the ease. And in that moment, standing at the side of the stage, drink in hand, watching the comedian push further into territory that should have been closed off, Dean made a decision. Nobody told him to. Nobody asked him to. Nobody else even seemed to notice in time. Dean put down his drink. Before we get to what Dean said, and we will get there, there is something you need to understand about why this moment mattered. Not just to Frank. To everyone in that room who knew what loyalty actually looks like when it costs you something. We are building something here. a channel about Dean Martin, about the moments that most people missed, about the man behind the image. We are at 400 subscribers. If that story matters to you, subscribe now. Because what Dean said next and what happened backstage after is the part of this night that nobody wrote about. Until now. The comedian did not see Dean coming. He was facing the audience. He was in the middle of another line. The laugh was building again. Dean walked across the stage, not fast, not rushing. The way Dean always moved, like he had nowhere better to be and all the time in the world to get there. He came up behind the comedian, put his right hand on the man's left shoulder. The comedian turned, saw Dean, smiled, thought it was part of the act. It was not. Dean leaned toward the microphone. The room caught it. The shift in energy. Something was different. The audience felt it before they understood it. The comedian was still smiling, still holding the microphone, still thinking this was Dean playing along. Dean looked at the comedian. Then he looked at the audience. Then he looked at the microphone. 2,000 people went quiet. Not all at once, in a wave, like the silence moved from the front of the room to the back. Frank was watching, his jaw still tight, his hands still gripping the chair. Nobody in that room knew what Dean was about to say. Nobody knew if this was part of the show or something else entirely. The uncertainty was its own kind of silence. Dean leaned into the microphone. He said 4 words. The room held its breath. But we are not there yet, because to understand what those 4 words meant, you have to understand what Frank Sinatra meant to Dean Martin. And that is a story that started long before this night. Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra became friends in the early 1950s, before the Rat Pack, before Las Vegas, before all of it. They were both Italian-American, both from the Northeast, both men who had come from nothing and built something out of their own voices and their own nerve. But they were different in ways that mattered. Frank needed people to see him, to recognize him, to acknowledge what he was. He was not arrogant about it exactly. It was deeper than arrogance. It was need. Frank Sinatra needed to know that what he felt and what he created and what he sacrificed was real, was seen, was worthy. Ava Gardner had seen it. That was what made losing her so devastating. She had not needed him to be famous. She had seen past all of that to something underneath. And when she was gone, a part of Frank went with her. The part that felt known. Dean understood this, not because Frank told him, because Dean watched. Dean paid attention. While everyone else was caught up in the lights and the shows and the money, Dean was watching faces, watching eyes, watching what people looked like when they thought nobody was paying attention. Dean had grown up watching people. Steubenville, Ohio, the kind of town where you learned early to read a room or suffer the consequences. His father cut hair. His neighbors worked hard and felt things loudly or not at all. Dean learned to see the difference between what people said and what they meant. That skill followed him into every room he ever walked into. It followed him onto every stage. It made him the easiest person in any group to be around because he never made you feel like you had to explain yourself. Frank once said that Dean was the only man he knew who could walk into a tense room and make it feel like a Sunday afternoon without saying a single word. He meant it as a compliment. It was the highest one Frank gave. Dean saw Frank, not the image, the man. That is why what happened on stage that night was not a reflex. It was not instinct. It was knowledge. The knowledge of a person who had spent years watching someone they cared about and learning exactly where the soft places were. The joke about Ava Gardner was not just a joke. For Frank it was a wound being opened in public, in front of 2,000 people, by someone he trusted, someone he had let into his circle. Dan knew that. He felt it from across the stage, and he was not willing to stand there and watch it happen. Some people who were in that room that night said they knew something was happening the moment Dean put down his drink. Dean never put down his drink. Not mid-show, Not unless something was wrong. The drink was the signal. Nobody announced it. Nobody pointed it out. But the people who knew Dean well understood immediately. Sammy saw it from across the stage. He said nothing. He did not move. But he watched. Peter Lawford saw it too. He later said the moment Dean set down that glass, the whole energy on his side of the stage shifted, like a pressure change before a storm. Not alarming, just different, like the room knew something was about to happen before anyone in it did. The comedian kept going for another 20 seconds after Dean put down that glass. 20 seconds of laughter. 20 seconds of Frank's hands gripping tighter. 20 seconds of nobody else stepping in. Then Dean moved. Here is what 2,000 people saw. A man walk across a stage and put his hand on another man's shoulder. A pause. A lean toward a microphone. A few words. Silence. Here is what they did not see. The calculation behind it. The love behind it. The years of knowing Frank Sinatra that made those 4 words exactly the right 4 words at exactly the right moment. Nobody who was not inside Dean Martin's head that night could have seen all of that. But they felt the result. 2,000 people. Silent. Mid-laugh frozen. You are about to hear what Dean said, and I want you to hear it the right way. Not as a punchline, not as a dramatic moment in a story, but as what it actually was. A man protecting someone he loved, with the minimum force required. That is the art of it. Not too much. Just enough. We need 600 subscribers to keep building this channel. We are at 400 right now. Every subscribe keeps these stories alive. Subscribe before the reveal, because what happens after Dean speaks is just as important as the words themselves. Dean leaned into the microphone. He did not raise his voice. He did not change his expression. He did not make it dramatic. He said, "That's enough, Paul." That was it. 4 words. Certain. Final. The laughter stopped. Not slowly. It stopped. The comedian froze. His smile stayed on his face for a half second, the way a smile does when the brain has not yet caught up with the situation. Then it faded. He looked at Dean. Dean looked back. Still calm. Still holding the shoulder. His face said nothing and everything at the same time. It said, "You know what you did, and we both know you know, and that is all that needs to be said." The comedian stepped back from the microphone. The audience did not know what to do. Some people shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. The energy that had been laughter a moment ago had nowhere to go. It just hung there. Frank looked up. His hands loosened on the armrests. Something in his face changed. Not relief exactly, not gratitude. Something quieter than that. Recognition. The recognition of being seen. Dean turned back to the audience. He picked up his drink from where he had set it at the edge of the stage. He took a sip. He smiled. He said, "Where were we?" Not a question. A statement. A reset. Done. The show moved on. 2,000 people followed his lead. Because that is what happens when someone in the room knows exactly what they are doing. Everyone else lets them do it. The comedian told 2 more jokes. Neither of them touched Ava Gardner. Neither of them touched anything close to the line. The show finished. The audience gave a standing ovation. But the room was different for the last 20 minutes. Quieter in a way that had nothing to do with volume. The electricity was still there. The laughter was still real. There was just something underneath it now. Something that had not been there before. A sense of what this group actually was. Under all the jokes and the drinks and the ease. What they were was people who had each other. And on that night in October 1960, 2,000 people in the Copa room got to witness what that actually looked like. Most of them did not fully understand what they had seen. They went home and told people the show was great. That the Rat Pack was everything the legend said. They were right, but not for the reasons they thought. Backstage was quiet after the show. The Copa room emptied slowly. The staff cleared glasses. The lights on the main stage went half down. Outside, the city was doing what Las Vegas always does, moving forward without stopping. The Rat Pack gathered in the back room the way they always did after a show. Drinks, low voices, the particular kind of tired that comes after 2 hours of performing for 2,000 people. Frank sat in the corner. He had a drink in his hand. He was not talking. The comedian came to Dean first. He found Dean near the bar. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was sorry. He said he had gotten caught up in the laugh. He said he knew better. Dean looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "I know you do." That was it. No lecture, no long explanation. Just "I know you do," which meant you already understand what happened. We do not need to talk about it more than this. The comedian nodded. He crossed the room to Frank. What he said to Frank was private. Nobody reported it exactly, but people who were in that room said the conversation was short, and when it was over, Frank looked like something had been released. Not fixed, not healed, released. The way a muscle releases after being held tight too long. Frank looked across the room at Den. He did not say anything. He raised his glass slightly, the smallest possible gesture. Dean raised his back. That was their whole conversation about what had happened. 2 glasses raised across a room. Everything said. Nothing wasted. Nobody else in the room made a thing of it. Nobody brought it up. Nobody congratulated Dean or analyzed the moment. They just continued the way people continue when something real has happened and everyone has the good sense to let it be what it was. Frank stayed later than usual that night. He bought the next round. He told a story about a recording session that went wrong in a way that made everyone laugh, including himself. He was lighter. That was the only word for it. Not happy in any dramatic sense. Just lighter. Like something he had been carrying without realizing it had been quietly set down. Nobody mentioned Ava Gardner. Nobody mentioned what had happened on stage. The evening just moved forward the way evenings do when the people in the room trust each other enough to let the difficult things pass without dissecting them. Dean played cards until 2 in the morning. He won $80 and left. The comedian never made that mistake again. Not in any show. Not in any context. The line that had been invisible before was visible now. He knew where it was because he had crossed it and seen what happened. Some lines become clear only after you step over them. This one was clear now. But Den had not humiliated him to make it clear. He had not made a speech. He had not turned it into a lesson. He had simply stopped it calmly, firmly, without making the comedian into a villain. That was the precision of it, the thing that made it work. A lesser man would have made it bigger, would have made it a confrontation, would have used the moment to demonstrate loyalty in a way that everyone could see and admire. Dean made it small, small enough that only the people who mattered understood it fully, small enough that the comedian could absorb it without being destroyed by it, small enough that could receive it without having to feel like he needed rescuing, because that was the other thing Dean understood. Frank Sinatra did not want to be rescued. He wanted to be protected. There is a difference. Rescue says you could not handle it. Protection says I will not let it go that far. Dean never let it go that far. He stepped in exactly when he needed to and no sooner. He used exactly the words required and no more. He resolved it and moved forward without looking back. That is a skill that has no name. But everyone who has ever had a friend like that knows exactly what it feels like. You do not always notice it in the moment. Sometimes you only understand it later. At 2 in the morning in a quiet room when you realize that something that could have been much worse was not, and you start thinking about why, and you trace it back to a moment. A hand on a shoulder, 4 words, a pivot back to the show, and you understand that someone was watching when you did not know you needed watching. Frank Sinatra understood it that night, not in theory, in fact, in the weight that was no longer on his chest, in the way the rest of the evening felt possible again. Dean did not know that Frank felt all of this. Or maybe he did. Either way, it did not matter to him. He had not done it to be felt. He had done it because Frank was his friend, and the thing that was happening was wrong, and he was the only one moving. There is a certain kind of person who moves when everyone else waits, not because they are braver, not because they are wiser, because they are paying attention when everyone else has looked away. Den was that person. He had always been that person, long before the fame, long before Las Vegas, long before anyone knew his name. The Copa room went dark that night around 2 in the morning. The cleaners came in. The chairs were stacked. The glasses were collected. The stage that 2,000 people had watched went quiet. Nothing about the room looked different the next day. But something had happened there. Something small and real and true. A man had seen his friend hurting and had done exactly the right thing in exactly the right way. Nobody wrote about it in the papers. Nobody awarded him anything for it. He just did it. And then he picked up his drink. And then he moved on. That was Dean Martin. Frank Sinatra had the voice. He had the fame. He had the career that defined an era. But on this night in October 1963, what he had most was Dean Martin standing at the side of the stage watching. That is what this story is really about. Not the joke, not the silence, the watching. We are 400 subscribers trying to reach 600. If you want more stories like this one, the moments that show who these men actually were, subscribe now. The playlist is waiting. 4 words, that's enough, pal, not affrontation. Not a public display of loyalty for the audience to applaud. 4 words. Dean understood something that most people never figure out. The most powerful thing you can do in a room is say exactly what needs to be said, and nothing more, not less, not more. Exactly enough. Too little and the moment passes. Too much and it becomes about you. Dean made it about Frank, not about himself, not about the comedian. About Frank. About stopping the thing that was hurting the person he cared about. That is the definition of loyalty. Not speeches about it. Not demonstrations of it. The quiet act of seeing something happening and stepping in before it goes further. The audience saw a small moment in a big show. 4 words and a pause. Frank saw something else. He saw a man who had been watching, who had noticed, who had decided without hesitation that the laugh was not worth the cost. There is a version of that night where nobody steps in, where the joke lands and the audience roars and the show moves on and Frank sits in the front row holding his armrests and nobody says a thing. That version of the night ends the same way in terms of the show. Ovation, drinks backstage, tired quiet people. But Frank goes home different, carrying something he should not have to carry, something small that becomes heavy in the dark. Dean did not let that happen. People who study the Rat Pack talk about Frank as the leader, the one who held everything together, the one with the power and the presence and the name that opened every door. They are right. Frank was all of that. But on that night in October 1963, the man who held the room together was not the one in the front row. It was the one at the side of the stage, watching, quiet, ready. Dean Martin was not trying to be a hero. He was just being a friend, a real one, the kind that does not wait to be asked. The boy from Steubenville, Ohio, the one who changed his name from Dino Crossetti to Dean Martin and built a life out of a voice and a talent for making people feel at ease. He never lost the instinct for who needed protecting and when. He was not the loudest person in the Rat Pack. He was not the most intense or the most driven or the most complicated. But in the moment that mattered, he was the one who saw it coming. And he stepped in. 4 words. The room went quiet. Frank Sinatra felt seen. That is enough.